for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Harvard Kennedy School. We are delighted to host tonight's discussion of a book that is at once highly instructive and completely terrifying, How to Steal a Presidential Election by Larry Lessig and Matthew Seligman. Before we begin, I would like to say that the Ash Center acknowledges the land on which Harvard University sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. I'd like to thank all of the Ash Center's outreach partners for today's event. Those partners include Protect Democracy, the Leadership Now Project, the Campaign Legal Center, State Democracy Defenders, the Network for Responsible Public Policy, and Represent Us. Tonight's discussion is being recorded, and you will receive a link to that recording in an email following the conclusion of the event tonight. You will also be able to find tonight's event on the Ash Center's YouTube channel. We're going to reserve the last 20 minutes to respond to questions from the audience. So you should submit questions. You may do so anytime via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Finally, I'd like to introduce tonight's moderator, who is Ian Bassin. Ian is the co-founder and executive director of Protect Democracy. Among many roles, he has served as Associate White House Counsel from 2009 to 2011. With that, let me hand it over to Ian.
Thanks, Arkan, and welcome everybody to our discussion tonight. I am very privileged to be joined here by the two authors of the book, How to Steal a Presidential Election, Matthew Seligman and Larry Lessig. Matthew is a fellow at the Constitutional Law Center at Stanford University and also a partner at the law firm Strisson Marr, where he started the election law practice. Larry is the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership at Harvard University and founder of Equal Citizens, who has helped promote this event tonight. So although this is not a presidential debate, and it will not be that nasty much of a tussle and people fighting for the microphone, I do want to borrow one element of presidential debates, which is before we get into the questions about the book, I want to allow each of the authors and panelists to offer a bit of an opening statement just to kind of set context here and introduce us to what they are trying to do with this book, how they want to set this up. And so let me first ask Matt, if you could offer kind of your opening thoughts, then we'll have Larry do it. And then I want to dive into some questions to really dig into the important things that you guys have tried to elucidate in this book. So Matt, let me offer you the floor to table set for us a little bit.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks to the Ash Center and the Harvard Kennedy School for hosting this great event. So Larry and I started writing this book after January 6th, 2021, but it had its origins before. So in the fall of 2020, Larry and I co-taught a class at Harvard Law School titled Wargaming 2020. And it was a seminar, and we worked with our students to try to figure out all of the ways that a presidential election could be stolen. And we had as our focus two particular kinds of ideas. The first was that this was a new innovation in the way that the electoral system could be manipulated. We've seen for decades, for centuries, voter suppression and other traditional forms of electoral mischief. But what we started to see and what we started to fear was the manipulation of the legal system through bad faith use of procedures. And in particular, and this is the second part, we thought that one of the most vulnerable parts of the legal system that hadn't really been exploited yet was the legal architecture of the Electoral College. The appointment of electors, how electors cast their ballots in the Electoral College, and then how those electoral votes are counted and a winner of the presidential election declared on January 6th. So it turns out that this legal architecture was catastrophically vulnerable to manipulation. After the events of January 6, 2021, both the attempts at legal manipulation and the violence, we started thinking about, well, what happens next? And so we wanted to focus this book not just on the vulnerabilities that we saw attempts to exploit in 2020 and 2021, but to keep our eye on the future about the risks that we might see exploited in this coming election and elections after that. And with that, I'll pass it over to Larry.
Yeah, thank you, Matt, and thank you, Ian, and the Ash Center for hosting this. And I'm especially eager to have this conversation with you, Ian, just because the work that Protect Democracy has been doing is, of course, complementary to the concerns that we're raising in this book. But I want to make sure that we keep focused in this conversation about how the particular problem of 2024 is just one small part of a more general problem with the structure we have for electing the president. Now, you could say that at base is the fact that we don't have a national popular vote, and I would agree with that. But beyond the concerns about throwing the system out completely, I think we have to recognize that even under the existing system, we have structured the way campaigns are run because of the winner-take-all system in the states to make it so that it's only a handful, this year probably 6, maybe 8 states, that will decide the presidential election. So one of the chapters I'm sure we'll touch on in the conversation about the book, that we consider the hypothetical of a state legislature before election day just declaring there won't be an election day in their state. Or if there is, that won't decide the electors. They will themselves, the legislature will themselves pick the slate of electors. And I think most constitutionalists think that would actually be completely constitutional. But I think most non-lawyers look at that and say that's just outrageous. But the point to focus on is that, in fact, at least 40 states, maybe as much as 42 states, have effectively done that by deciding that all electoral votes will go to the plurality winner of the popular vote. Because what that means is, in states that are not swing states, the campaign just doesn't matter. We know today how at least 40 states will decide on election day. And so I think this is an opportunity to begin to think, we hope, much more deeply about what can we do to improve the democratic responsiveness of the system we have for electing the president.
Well, and I actually want to start somewhere, Larry, that you kind of just were hitting on a little bit, which is, and we're going to dive into some of the particular scenarios that you guys lay out and how they might play out, and then come around at the end a little bit to what could be done, perhaps to mitigate or prevent those things from happening. But I want to start at a little bit of a high level, which is this idea that you could steal an election, and in particular, this idea that you could lawfully steal an election, because when most people, I think of the concept of stealing something, they think, well, that's by definition illegal. That's improper. That's the whole idea, that theft is illegal. So the notion that you could legally steal something does feel a bit like a contradiction in terms. So I'm curious how we should understand that an election could be considered stolen and yet perhaps properly or lawfully done so. So maybe, Larry, since you were just sort of touching a little bit on that, let's just start with, how do we understand that tension, that contradiction in terms? Is it ever possible to lawfully steal an election?
Well, I think many people after the 2016 election had a sense that the election had been stolen because the winner of the popular vote did not win the presidency. And I think all of us here would agree that that's not actually a proper way to think about 2016. Though the majority of the popular vote went for Hillary Clinton, under the rules as they existed at the time, that was appropriately allocated to Donald Trump as the winner of the election. But what we're talking about in this book is really loopholes that the law has opened up that would give the opportunity to either side, and we're most concerned in the book about the MAGA side, to exploit the loophole to bring about, whether through affirmative votes in the House or just by blocking the opportunity for a problem to be reversed because of the structure of the Electoral Count Act, to bring about a result that doesn't even comport to the standards of 2016. Obviously, I think everybody hopes that we have an election, even if it's for the other side, in my view, that's the majority of the popular vote and the majority of the electoral vote go together. If we don't have that, if we have an electoral vote majority again, that's proper under the system as we have it right now. But we're concerned with these loopholes, one very particular that's been opened up by the Supreme Court, but others that exist because of the Electoral Count Act that will bring about a result that on reflection, people will say, hey, that's just not what the system was supposed to do. And I think that's our concern, that we're going to have a presidency where if in fact that happens, the amount of resistance and frustration and really loss of trust in the institution could be catastrophic.
And Matt, Larry just said that in the book, you're concerned about potentially either side using these loopholes to produce a result that's really at odds with, we think, with the way that most people expect the system to work, but that you're primarily concerned about how sort of the MAGA faction might do that. And you guys spend a good amount of time in the book talking about why that is a concern of yours. It's not about you guys being on one side of the partisan aisle or another. I would point out that I think probably during your lives you've occupied different spaces in the ideological spectrum. Professor Lessig clerked for Antonin Scalia, and I think at one point probably would have self-described as Republican. And so, can you say a little bit more about why you're more concerned about the MAGA side, even though either side could potentially take advantage of some of the loopholes you identify?
Because the political movement that we're seeing that would take advantage of these legal loopholes is fundamentally anti-democratic in some respects, and that doesn't reflect, sort of the old school Republican Party. It doesn't reflect any particular policy position on taxes or trade or immigration or abortion. It's an idea about a commitment to the democratic system or the absence of that commitment. And the best evidence that we have that there's one political movement in the United States that lacks that commitment is what we saw happen in 2020. Now, the roots of that go earlier than that. There's been a long history of the rejection of democratic results in American politics, but more recently, even in the 2016 election, and this is what prompted me to start thinking about these issues deeply, then candidate Donald Trump said that he wouldn't accept the results of the election in 2016 if he lost. And then we obviously saw that commitment to anti-democratic outcomes magnified to catastrophic results in 2020 and 2021. So the reason why there's reason to be concerned about a particular political movement in the United States exploiting these loopholes where there's not a corresponding reason to worry about that with the Democratic Party or even parts of the Republican Party. I don't think anybody would say that Mitt Romney would have engaged in these types of manipulations when he lost in 2012. So it isn't the Republican Party and it's not conservatism. It's the part of the Republican Party and the conservative movement that fundamentally rejects the democratic system and is willing, through conspiracy theories and legal manipulations, to undermine the legitimate results of elections.
Yeah, and I'm glad you guys took some time to articulate that in the book. I think this is one of the most challenging dynamics of the moment that we are in for all of our institutions and the public at large to really process, digest, and metabolize, because I think most of us have grown up in an era in which, by and large, although not entirely so, we understood that both parties were at root fundamentally committed to our constitutional representative democratic form of government. And I think we forget that that hasn't always been true throughout American history. You can look back at periods in American history in which, for example, in the antebellum period through the Jim Crow period, it was the Democratic Party that was fundamentally anti-democratic. And people forget that during those periods in history, the notion that bipartisanship was the order of the day was ne'er to be found. The Reconstruction Amendments were passed by the Republican Party almost entirely over the Democratic Party's objection. It was a one-party form of government. In the more modern era, after the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, the Democratic Party did do some things that were anti-democratic. There was some gerrymandering that went on in various places, but by and large, we saw more attacks on voting rights probably coming from the Republican Party, and yet both parties would have accepted the outcome of an election. I think, although we can only speculate, we all might agree that had the 2000 election gone differently and had the Supreme Court reached the opposite conclusion, that it is more likely than not that George W. Bush would have conceded in a form or manner very similar to the way that Al Gore did. And the fact that we are now living in a moment when, as you note, a faction of one of the parties, by the evidence of their past behavior, is outside of that spectrum is really hard for us to understand and process. And I would note that the Washington State Republican Party just recently adopted some language at its state convention suggesting they no longer wanted to use the term democracy to describe what it is that we are trying to engage in here in this country. So glad that we sort of established that. It's a very difficult thing for us to navigate, but it's important to address that reality. So Larry, I want to turn back to you. You guys, in your book, you do a bunch of chapters laying out different potential scenarios where loopholes could be taken advantage of to, quote unquote, steal an election. And then at the end of each chapter, you rate the likelihood of that particular scenario coming to pass and having the potentially disastrous consequences that you fear. But the book's out. You've had some time to marinate on this. You've probably had some conversations about it. So now in hindsight, what I want to ask is for you now to rethink about the thing that you're most afraid of. It's a year from now, and one of your scenarios has come to pass, and it has had the disastrous consequence that you feared. I'll ask each of you this question. We'll start with you, Larry. Which one is it? And tell us the story in hindsight of how it happened.
Well, I'm going to take the lead on one of them, although I'm not sure I think this is the most likely anymore. But let me take the lead on the electors one. So, one of the concerns that we talk about in the book is a concern raised by the Supreme Court's decision in a case that I was involved with, a case that was determining whether electors had a constitutional discretion to vote their conscience. In the 2016 election, a bunch of electors from Colorado and Washington State, Democratic electors, voted for a Republican, not Donald Trump, but a Republican, as part of a movement to try to get other electors, primarily Republican electors, to vote for somebody other than Donald Trump and throw the election into the House and let the House decide whether Donald Trump should be president or some other Republican should be president. And the question that was raised in those cases was whether the laws in the states, which expressly told them how they had to vote, were constitutional. Because the intuition suggested by the word elector, and certainly the history at the founding about the conception of elector, was that though you picked an elector expecting you knew how the elector was going to vote, just like you pick a Republican senator expecting how you expect the Republican senator is going to vote, it would be crazy to imagine you could legally regulate the senator. And the claim we made is it was also crazy to imagine you could legally regulate the electors. Okay, Supreme Court heard that argument, 9-0, decided the other way. So what the court said was, there's a long tradition of states exercising power over the electors, and the electors, quote, have no rights against that state power. So that tees up the first, I think, maybe one of the most compelling, maybe the most compelling concerns. So imagine the state of Wisconsin is an extremely close election. And a big premise of our whole book is that none of this is a concern if it's not a close election. But if it is a close election, Wisconsin's extremely close. Imagine it by a sliver goes for Joe Biden. But the Republicans in the state say, we don't think actually Joe Biden won. There was a lot of mischief in Milwaukee. So we don't believe Joe Biden is the actual winner of the election. So what they do is they pass a resolution in the legislature, which at that point will still be a supermajority Republican legislature, telling the electors that they must vote for Donald Trump, not Joe Biden, exercising the power that the Supreme Court said state legislatures have, and that the electors, in response to that power, have, quote, no rights. Now, the trick in that scenario is that legislature would have to depend on something that's called the independent state legislature doctrine. The legislature would have to say, we, the legislature, not the legislature plus the governor, get to do this, because obviously the governor is a Democratic governor and wouldn't stand for it. But the point is, if they can advance that argument compellingly, or in another state that where they might have a sufficient majority with even the governor, that would tee up the question whether, in fact, that's what the Supreme Court meant, that the legislature could tell the electors to vote contrary to even how the voters have voted. Now, my belief, I think Matt's belief, is that's not what the Supreme Court meant. But there's a race to get to the court and to get the question resolved before the electors vote. Because I think the other problem, maybe the one Matt's going to talk about, is if you don't resolve this question before the electors vote, under the Electoral Count Reform Act, there's basically no way to fix the problem. So that's my anxiety, that this loophole opened up by those electors' cases will be exploited in a way that's not consistent with what the court intended, but sets the question up so that it could have an effect before the court acts. We were kind of excited that Justice Alito raised the question in the Trump versus Anderson case, the Colorado case, And a little bit hopeful that they would drop a footnote saying, yeah, obviously that's not permitted, but they didn't address it. So that question remains open.
Okay, Matt, since we're doing nightmare scenarios here, it's a year from now and you're writing the history of what has happened. What's the one that is currently most keeping you up at night?
Well, I'll have to pick one of many, but the one that Larry alluded to. So there have been a couple of changes since 2020 and January 6, 2021. And one of the most important is that Congress adopted the Electoral Count Reform Act, which against all odds, we got some kind of election law reform, and it repaired some important vulnerabilities in the old Electoral Count Act of 1887. But it's not a perfect law. It didn't fix every vulnerability, and it actually created a new one that both Larry and I are deeply concerned about. So one of the problems that we saw in 2020 was these alternate electors. And that was a key part of the scheme to try to reverse the results on January 6th, either through Mike Pence or through Republican members of Congress voting to count these alternate or fake electors' votes rather than the real ones. Now, the Electoral Count Reform Act tries to prevent the possibility of multiple slates of electors. And that's a good idea. It's an intuitive idea because the idea ultimately is that Congress on January 6th shouldn't be in the business, as Mitch McConnell, of all people, said on the morning of January 6, 2021, it shouldn't be a national board of elections. It's not supposed to be resolving election disputes. That's the job of recounts and courts in litigation prior to all of that. So it was a good idea, but there's a problem. And here's the problem, that the Electoral Count Reform Act says that the electors that vote on Electors Day, which every elector in the entire Electoral College throughout the country has to vote on the very same day, and it's in mid-December. And if they don't vote then on that day, there are no votes to be counted. Okay, so the Electoral Count Reform Act says that prior to that day, the governor has to certify the electors that have been appointed by the state. And this is great, it provides a judicial backstop. It says, well, if the governor goes rogue, this is one of the scenarios we were really concerned about. If the governor goes rogue and certifies the wrong slate of electors, you can go to court, you can get a court order saying that the governor has to certify the right slate of electors. Okay, sounds great. And then on January 6th, Congress can count the votes only by those electors that have been certified by the governor on or prior to Electors Day. It's a rational system. But here's the problem. If there's an ongoing election dispute in the middle of December, which there have been multiple times in our history, then you can have a situation where there is no certified slate in the middle of December, or you could have a situation where the results actually flip after the middle of December, where there's an ongoing recount or litigation that flips the results. And then according to the Electoral Count Reform Act, it seems like those final results, once the recount is completed, once the court case is decided, actually couldn't be decided. And it seems like Congress could be forced to count the votes by the electors that actually lost the election. And so just to fill out this hypothetical a little bit more, imagine if Bush v. Gore had been decided on December 31st. Part of Bush v. Gore's rationale for stopping the recount is that everything had to be done by the safe harbor deadline, which is even before when the electors vote. But there's no guarantee that's going to happen. If Bush v. Gore gets decided on December 31st, the next Bush v. Gore, Trump v. Biden, gets decided by the Supreme Court on December 31st, there's no way for Congress to count the electoral votes of whoever actually wins that court case if they weren't already in the lead in the middle of December. And to top it all off, people know this. And so people in states, partisans in states, can slow things down throughout the process. If it looks like you're in the lead and the result might flip, just slow things down so the court case isn't finished, so the recount isn't finished in time for the electors' votes, and you can steal that state's electoral votes.
Okay, so now everybody's reaching for their mailbox. And so I want to offer a little bit, perhaps, of cabining of the dangers here. And Matt, let me stay with you for a second. So, and these are just two of the scenarios that are laid out in the book. But let's narrow a little bit to, okay, these are legally plausible. But when we get to what actually realistically might happen, maybe we can cabin some of this a little bit. So for example, in Matt, the scenarios you were just describing in which the ultimate resolution of what the actual voters wanted doesn't actually get resolved until after what is now called the federal deadline, what used to be called sort of the safe harbor date. Is it correct that at least in some states, Michigan and Arizona in particular, those states have now clarified their process for resolving disputes over how voters voted to be resolved in time to meet the federal deadline? So we could say, at least with respect to Michigan and Arizona, we think probably the scenario you laid out there unlikely to happen in those states because they've got a plan for resolving disputes before the federal deadline. However, perhaps in other states, Wisconsin, North Carolina, that have not actually taken the steps that Arizona and Michigan have, maybe some of that still might be a problem there. So it's not that the problem is entirely gone, but maybe geographically we could begin to narrow it. Would that be accurate to say it's not everywhere we have to worry about, but some places more than others, perhaps?
I think a qualified yes. And so you point out a really important issue that, so much of what goes on in elections is not just a matter of the strategy and the manipulation, but also the nuts and bolts of compliance. Election administrators have incredibly difficult jobs, and now they have a new law that they have to comply with. And they often need the legislature to step in and to update state laws to be in compliance with the new deadlines in the Electoral Count Reform Act. And I know that there are a lot of organizations, including Protect Democracy, that are doing incredible work to help state legislatures understand how they have to update their laws and election administrators to understand how they have to comply with these new deadlines. So you're absolutely right that there are some states that have passed laws that bring their state procedures into compliance, at least in principle, with these new deadlines, and some states that have not. So that helps. It certainly helps, at least in those states. Now, there's a further question about whether those state laws are complied with, if there's federal litigation that interferes. So, for example, you can imagine a situation like Bush v. Gore, where there was a federal constitutional issue about the recount procedure in Florida. What the court reasoned in Bush v. Gore is that, okay, so state law in Florida says that you have to finish the recount by a certain date, which it's not clear that's actually what Florida state law said, but that's what the Supreme Court said, and then said there's no way that you can possibly complete that recount in that period of time while complying with the Equal Protection Clause. And so you can imagine these complicated interactions between federal law and state law, where these well-intentioned systems that, if they work the way they're supposed to, would have a final resolution of any election dispute by the day the electors vote, if that's what actually happens.
Yeah, let me just build on that, because I think it's important to recognize, we're in a time of constitutional hardball, which is why this is such a hard question. I think in most times, and 2000 is a great example of that, at a certain point, people are going to accept the results. But we're at a time, I think, where both sides feel like the election is existential. Certainly Donald Trump thinks the election is existential for him, but even just party people believe the election is existential. They'll make whatever move is necessary. And so, yes, Protect Democracy has taken the lead in trying to clean up state laws to push back their process so that they're going to decide this by election day. But the point is, the lawyers for the candidates recognize what the strategy here should be. If you're initially the winner in the state, you don't want any recount to have any effect on that result. And if you are suspicious that the recount might, you need to do everything you can to raise constitutional questions or whatever other good faith issues you could raise to slow the process down. And it might be that the changes, I think they've been fantastic changes, are enough. But what we've wondered is, why didn't the shift happen at the other end? So Marco Rubio suggested that they should move Electors' Day to the end of December, or maybe just before January 6th. Why not? Why not create the longest time to allow the process to be completed, fully reflecting all the claims that have been made? I think one of the concerns in 2020, though obviously I think the election was not stolen, and I think the right result happened. I think one of the reasons anxiety or concerns about 2020 survive is that so many of those cases were decided invoking legal doctrines that essentially give the court the ability not to consider the substance of the case. And I suspect a number of the reasons for that is they just didn't have time to fully reflect on all the issues that were presented in the case. So I don't understand why Congress didn't give the process more time within the boundaries of the Constitution, and then we could have had these questions resolved in an orderly way, and then have Electors' Day, and then have January 6th after that.
So normally when I talk about issues, threats to democracy, I am the dark and depressing voice that people walk away from all gloomy. And so I'm using the opportunity here to be the lighthearted sidekick and try to lift us up, since you guys have written a pretty dark and foreboding book. So I appreciate you that I tried to get a little bit of good news in there. I'm going to try again. You've got another chapter called Rogue Governors, which talks about the fact that because the Electoral Count Reform Act gives deference to the certification that is submitted by the governor in an event in which there may be some contest as to which slate of electors is proper and valid and accepted, and the House of Congress can't agree. The governor's one should prevail. And what you worry about is, but what if the governor is the bad actor? Well, then you've almost locked yourselves into a suicide pact with the rogue governor. And so I want to ask this: in the 7 states that I think most political prognosticators think are most likely to decide this election, I don't look at any of them and say there's a governor who is likely to behave in a rogue, bad faith way. The Democratic governors in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Arizona have shown no signs that they would behave in a rogue, bad faith way. The Republican governors, and I should add to that list, let me come back to North Carolina. The Republican governors in Georgia, Brian Kemp, has been a model of trying to push back against sort of Trumpist attempts to overturn the election as he did in 2020. And even Joe Lombardo in Nevada has not been a super Trumpy candidate and governor. Got chastised by Trump when he was running for sort of speaking out a little bit against Trumpism. He kind of put himself back in line, but he's not been super Trumpy. And then, of course, in North Carolina, although there is an extremely, I would say, dangerous bad faith candidate as the Republican nominee, that person, even if they were to win in 2024, would not be presiding over the results of the election in 2024. So is it safe to say that if you read the book and you're worried about all these things, perhaps realistically, the rogue governor scenario may be the one we need to worry about at least this cycle, although that could change in future cycles? And maybe, I don't know, Larry, do you have a thought on that?
Well, I completely agree with your accounting, although I'm a little unsure about North Carolina, because the Constitution makes, if Robinson wins, the Constitution says he's governor as of January 1st. So imagine he's governor as of January 1st, and he issues a new certification. I don't know quite how that works. Like if he declares that the old certification was wrong under the Hawaii story, that that change was recognized. But I think you're right. I think that we're fortunate that we've had governors the Republican governors who so far have done the right thing. Again, Georgia, though, was not really extremely uncertain at the time that Kemp did what Kemp did and Raffensperger did what Raffensperger did. The concern would be, imagine it is uncertain. And I don't mean uncertain in the sense that the vote is as close as Florida in 2000, but that there's a credible belief among the MAGA side of the story that it's an illegitimate election, that there's a real claim that votes were stolen or stuffed, and I don't mean real in the sense of true. I just mean real in the sense that people are genuinely believing it. And I do think that in that case, you could imagine that the political calculations have to shift, and so I think this is still a vulnerability, not as pronounced as we feared for 2024. But something we should certainly think about when we think about 2028 and after that.
And I'll just add,
Go ahead, Matt. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I just want to add that, the good news that you just gave, and it is good news, so we should all be very happy about. Ian has given us good news. And it's also good news that we have by the very thinnest of margins. Because in 2022, Kari Lake, one of the most committed election deniers in the country, came extremely close to winning the governor's race in Arizona. Doug Mastriano, also one of the most committed election deniers in the country. He wasn't quite as close as Kari Lake, but he was the Republican candidate for governor in Pennsylvania. And if those races go differently, then you could have an extremely different situation on our hands. And so, we have defeated the candidates who have been the most committed election deniers that would be the ones who would pull that trigger for now. But the Republican Party did nominate Robinson in North Carolina, and he's even odds to win the governorship. And, so this is not just a problem that we have to worry about in the past. And for this election, this is one we have to worry about in the future, that there is a persistent anti-democratic movement within the Republican Party that seems committed to running candidates who would use these methods of legal manipulation, if not now, later.
Yeah, and I should, based on both things that both of you said, I would qualify my remarks on Governor Kemp. I think I used the word model. I don't know that I would go that far. I thought he did a good job in 2020 on pushing back on what Trump was trying to do in the state. But when he was both Secretary of State and candidate in 2018, I don't think he was a model of integrity and avoiding conflicts of interest there. And obviously, notwithstanding what Trump tried to do in his state, has come out and said that he will support Trump for president. So perhaps model was going a bit far, but at least showed some inclination to resist at least what Trump tried to do in 2020. To Larry's point, who knows what the political climate is in 2024. So we're going to go shortly to taking some questions from everyone else, but I want to pivot for a minute now to the solutions part of all of this. And I want to start perhaps with a high level question. And Larry, why don't I give you this high level question, and then maybe some more practical, logistical nuts and bolts on solutions that Matt will turn to you for. But Larry, one of the things that you write in the book is that our system was not built to withstand bad faith, and that it's almost impossible to build a system that is foolproof when people are not operating in good faith. And so before we get into sort of the mechanics of what can be done, how should we think about whether anything can be done, or whether any system to some extent, if you have a degree of bad faith that is supported by enough people and perhaps enough institutions, that may be pretty hard to guard against. And how should we understand and think about that before we get into, okay, given that, what can be done? So yeah, Larry.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the scariest statistics about January 6th, 2021, is that the number of people who believe the election was stolen on January 6th, 2021, is basically the same as the number of people who think it's stolen today. That's because we live in a media ecosystem that has become so good at channeling us into our own bubbles of reality, and the constant flow in each of these channels is reinforcing of views that are deeply contradictory to each other. And you can think about it at the cable television level. It's obviously true what goes on at the level of the internet, where the engagement-based business model of internet social media platforms the AI tries to find the thing that triggers us the most, and the thing that triggers us the most is outrage and anger and hatred. And that reality produces the base that these politicians have to respond to. I am sure that on January 6th, when many Republicans went to bed, many Republicans in Congress went to bed, they thought, thank God we're finished with that. We're finished with that man. His career is over. Remember Lindsey Graham on the floor of the Senate saying, that's it, I'm off this train. And then they woke up the next day and they got their overnight polling back, and they found that the base was still just as committed. And committed because they're living in this world that feeds them into that view of reality. Now, that's what creates the conditions for bad faith. I think the fact that we have this persistent tuning of our views into this conflicting and existential frame means that you're going to have people who believe they need to act, to do whatever they can to save, quote, save the republic. And obviously nothing we're talking about in this book is going to address that problem. I think we have to think, how do we get the leaders in particular to rise above it? And obviously in 2020, there were many, not just in the States, but Mitch McConnell, who that took the lead in the Senate to set a tone of the right way to think about this kind of conflict. And we need more of them and fewer Josh Hawley interventions in this process if we're going to get through it, given what I think is the fundamental reason why we're in such conflict right now.
So at a character level, we need more principled statespersons. At a legal and logistical level, Matt, what can we do to address some of the problems you've identified?
Well, so we can't ever design a system that is completely impervious to bad faith. It's not as if James Madison, if he had only lived long enough, he could have designed a system that perfectly balances everything like the perfectly designed clock. But we can narrow the window for bad faith actors to manipulate the system. And to give one example, there's no reason, as Larry said, that the electors should be voting in the middle of December. That date should be moved back, and Congress can do that right now. I think that we think about things, it's an election year. How could there possibly be a law that passes Congress that in any way tinkers with the mechanics of the election system? But this is something that's not just in the interests of Democrats, it's in the interests of anybody who doesn't want chaos. And one has to hope that that's everyone. So there are some technical fixes to the Electoral Count Reform Act like that. You could clarify the grounds for objection. Does it or does it not include objecting to electoral votes on the ground that the candidate is ineligible to hold the presidency, perhaps because he engaged in insurrection? Is that a valid ground for objection? We can clarify that, and the existing law is insufficiently clear about that. So there are these technical fixes that can be done that can narrow the grounds of opportunity for bad faith manipulation of the law. But at the end of the day, the statute can only do so much. And so we have to zoom back to a broader level where also both at the states, where the states can update their laws to create better dispute resolution mechanisms that place less discretion in the hands of politicians and make sure that independent courts are the ultimate decision maker, to clarify election procedures so there isn't as much fodder for conspiracy theories about immigrants or other ineligible voters voting. So there's so much we can do at every level of the system to improve it. But to echo back to Larry's point, in a cultural and media environment where it's so deeply polarized, not just as a matter of political preferences, but also as a matter of the perception of reality, there's only so much that we can do to prevent, to safeguard, to create a legal bulwark against a stolen election.
Wait, can I just add one more to that? Because I know this is work that you are doing too, Ian. I think it's really critical we think about how to educate the press, to make sure the press is sufficiently aware of the games that could be played so that they could diffuse the understandings that might support those games being played. I think in 2020, we saw many of even the leading people in our media infrastructure who just didn't understand the rules, and they didn't understand where people like Josh Hawley were just going off the reservation with their kinds of objections and complaints. And I feel like part of the reason we felt we should write this book is if we could raise awareness and understanding enough so that going into the election, we almost have a leaderboard about the issues that we ought to be concerned about. And then if this issue is manifesting itself, an easy way to unpack both sides of the issue and how to understand the issue, it might empower them to be much better defenders of what is true about what our law requires and not so vulnerable to the kind of games that we saw played in 2020.
Well, I want to open it up and take some questions from the audience. I'm going to read off a couple that are coming through. But one thing I want to know before I do that, which is I'm really heartened by something that might surprise people to be heartened by, which is if you're reading it all in the chat, there is a range of opinions in the chat. There are opinions in there that are kind of on all sides of the political spectrum. And I just think in a moment when democracy is in peril, having a space where people are offering all different perspectives, deeply disagreeing with each other, and being able to do so without any fear of repercussion or consequence, and there should be none, is wonderful. That's what democracy is about. I love that there's disagreement in the chat. And I think what I would say, wherever you're coming from in that chat, the fact that you have the ability to do that freely is worth preserving. And that's what this is all about. And there are countries in the world where you can't do that. And we wouldn't want to become one of those. So I just want to celebrate all that disagreement. I think it's a great model of what it is we're trying to protect. So let's go to some of the questions here. Matt, let me start with you. There's a question that asks essentially, aren't you just providing a roadmap for how someone could steal the election? Why would you use your brilliant legal brains and firepower to write all this out and give someone a blueprint for how to steal an election? Why do that?
So Larry and I thought about this question really carefully. We had thought about a lot of this in the years prior to 2020, and we didn't publish anything. But now, I think that we have to be sober-minded about the fact that the people who would steal the election have had 4 years to prepare. We were somewhat saved by the fact that the effort at the end of 2020 and early 2021 was shambolic. It was like the Keystone Cops in a lot of ways, and they didn't really understand the best ways to manipulate the system. The pieces weren't quite in place. It was all done at the very, very last minute. But that's changed, and the people who would want to take advantage of these legal loopholes have been working at it for 4 years. We're not the only ones. And so I don't think it's the case that no one would have thought of this if Larry and I hadn't published this book. I think, it's just inevitable that either in, the year since January 6, 2021, or in the fog of a disputed election, some of these ideas, maybe all of them, would have come to the minds of the people who would exploit them. And so the reason to publish the book, as Larry alluded to before, is to try to inoculate the legal and political system against these. So we're publishing these and we're saying these are ways to steal an election. These are not legitimate legal positions or the way that the system is supposed to work. Some of them there's not much legal defense about, and that's something we should be scared by, frankly. But we're not just printing the blueprints to a nuclear bomb that nobody else would have ever figured out. So that's the principle behind the book, that by raising awareness, both for the legal strategies that are really illegal, so people won't accept them, and so if we start to see a legal strategy that might work, that we can mobilize against it as it's happening. That's the goal of the book.
Yeah, I don't believe that one should publish regardless. And there were a couple of points in our writing this book where we wondered, should we talk about this? But in 2020, I faced this conflict directly because I wrote an essay after the election, before the electors voted, pointing out a really important loophole / weakness in the existing system now that the Supreme Court has said electors have to vote how they're pledged. And that is that if a candidate dies between Election Day and Electors Day, and his electors have to vote for that candidate, then it's easy to imagine that those votes get thrown away because they were supposed to be for the candidate, and they've got to vote for that candidate, and who knows how that gets resolved in a conflict, and that would throw it into the House or potentially change the result. And I came very close to publishing it, and then I realized that's a really bad idea because it's the one moment where you could imagine an act of violence flipping the election from one side to another. It wouldn't go to the vice president because there is no vice president yet. And so I spoke to the Biden campaign, but I didn't publish it. So I don't think it's obvious you should always publish it. But I do think that, publishing in February, which is what we did, gives the system adequate time to begin to inoculate itself and figure out whether there are fixes, especially fixes both sides ought to agree on. And I think Rubio's idea of moving the electors' day to the end of the year or the beginning of next year is something that both sides should like, because a recount game that Matt described is one that both sides could play. And so there's no reason to think that it benefits Democrats or Republicans. We're behind the veil, and we ought to do the right thing in the context where we're behind the veil.
Matt, I want to bundle a couple of questions together here that are all in a similar vein, building on something that Larry just said. They are in the vein of, so what can we do, right? So, and I don't mean by that like abstractly what sort of laws can be written, but someone's got a question. Do you have a sample letter to the editor that you could share that we could send? Has anyone started working on a bill, and what can we do to help advance it? Are there groups that are working to prevent the scenarios that you've outlined? You've mentioned obviously the one that I work for, but are there others that people could get involved with? People are looking for, okay, so they've attended this. What are their marching orders? What can they do to help prevent some of these nightmare scenarios?
Well, I'm so heartened to hear that people are taking this talk as a call to action, because that's exactly what it's intended to be. And so what can you do? So there's really two categories of things that you can do. The first category is to to try to participate in ways to change the system prior to election day. Write your representative, write your senator, and don't just limit yourself to the federal level, because of course, so much of this happens at the state level as well. So make sure that you make your political voices known now, because elected representatives are responsive to what they hear, and so if they get those letters, and talk to your friends, write letters to the editor, make it so there is a movement, a pro-democracy movement where you live, so it grows throughout the country, and then that can mobilize political change for the kinds of legal fixes that we're talking about, but also to make it so the politicians that are supposed to represent us are going to, we hope, act in good faith because they recognize that so many of their voters are committed to that. So that's one side. Now, to pile on top of that, yes, there are organizations. Protect Democracy is one of the marquee organizations, and there are many others that are working right now to design legal fixes that can be implemented at the state level, maybe even at the federal level, ahead of time, and to plan about what to do if these crises do arise. And so that legal work is being done by Protect Democracy, by Campaign Legal Center, by state democracy defenders. There's an umbrella organization called the Election Sabotage Response Network, which is standing up lawyers and organizations all around the country, federal organizations, or I should say national organizations, and local organizations, voting rights groups. And so there's a huge amount of mobilization. So, there is work that's being done every day, all day and all night, to try to prevent these crises from happening and to figure out what to do if they do. So that's one category. The other category is vote, because a basic premise of this book that we believe in is that in order for these strategies to be exploited, the election has to be close. It has to be within what I call the margin of manipulation. If one side or the other wins by 500,000 votes in a state, it's simply too big of a difference for there to be a plausible pathway to legal manipulation to flip the results. Even the types of political hardball moves like the state legislature stepping in, it would be so stunningly anti-democratic that even the most MAGA state legislatures wouldn't do that. And so by increasing the margin of victory for the pro-democracy candidates, that's how you make it so these strategies, these legal loopholes, just don't matter.
Yeah, I would add to that. I think that getting people on the record early is a valuable part to this strategy. So, after the Trump versus Anderson case, the case about Colorado excluding Trump because he's a so-called insurrectionist. There are many people wondering, as Matt was alluding to about the question whether on the floor of that January 6th, people could refuse to vote for Donald Trump because they believe he's an insurrectionist, and so therefore disqualified. Now, my own view is that that's not a proper basis for a member of Congress to withhold a vote. I think the Constitution is pretty clear. Their job is to count the votes. And the only basis in law for resisting one of those votes is that the vote was, quote, not regularly given. But by vote, this is something Josh Hawley didn't recognize, by vote, they're not talking about the vote of the voters, they're talking about the vote of the electors. So in a case like Pennsylvania in 2020, the case that Josh Hawley made the basis for the objection, every one of those Biden electors vote for Joe Biden. So it's pretty clear that those votes were regularly given. There was no legal basis for challenging those results. But what I think is encouraging is that when that question was raised, it was raised to leadership in the Democratic Party, and the leadership in the Democratic Party has already signaled that they don't believe that that would be a legitimate move on January 6th. Now let's see where they are on January 6th. But the point is, if we can begin to identify these scenarios and put to the politicians the question, would you make this move? At least at this moment, I think it's likely they would say they're going to do the right thing, and that makes it more likely that they would do the right thing when that time comes.
And if they don't say that, if they said they would take the manipulative strategy, then we know, and then the public knows, and then so it's on the record that people are knowing. That people know whether they're voting for somebody who is declaring their intention to steal the election if it's lost. So either way, getting politicians on the record is a powerful tool.
I'm going to try to see if I can't squeeze in two more questions here. And Larry, I'm going to come to you on this one. So there's a bit in the chat. I want to honor the diversity that I referenced before. I think it's really important. And I think there probably may be some skeptics on some of the arguments that you're making, and maybe even further than skeptics. I have heard this argument just in the work that I do that says, protect democracy. You're the ones who are trying to subvert democracy. Now, I fundamentally disagree with that. But I want to, Larry, give you a chance to respond to it. And let me not straw person it. Let me put it in, I think, perhaps the strongest frame that I could honor, which is to say, now, wait a minute, you're saying you litigated a case on behalf of giving electors the right to change the votes from the ones that they had essentially pledged to vote for in order to thwart the person who, as you said, had been lawfully elected under the rules that existed at the time in 2016 from ultimately being certified and inaugurated. Why should that not be viewed as a version of the kinds of sort of dangerous hardball tactics that you're talking about here?
Well, I mean, it's a fair question. And a lot of people have said I needed to be arrested, just like all of these electors in 2020 have been charged. The reason I think it's different is that my view, Equal Citizens took this case on because we believed it was important to resolve it one way or the other before it would decide a presidential election. So, and as we said when we took the case up, either way the court decides it is a victory because at least we know what the rule is before we get into a super close election. That's point number one. Point number two is, if you look at people who looked at the original understanding of the Constitution and the tradition that manifested, it seemed pretty clear that that was the right answer, that the electors had that constitutional authority. In the whole history of the Republic, there has been only one elector who ever switched to the other side and voted for the person he was not supposed to vote for. That was the very first faithless elector, a guy named Sam Miles, who in Pennsylvania was originally supposed to be an Adams elector in 1796 and became a Jefferson elector. And the reason he did that is that he said the election results, the voters' results, had turned out to be different from what they expected when they appointed him. So the history of electors is that they've been extremely responsible, not exercising that power irresponsibly. And I think the electors that I was defending were trying to do the right thing. Look, the people who voted for Hillary Clinton in Colorado and Washington, if you'd said to them, look, Hillary Clinton is not going to be president, but would you like the people who you elected to engage in a strategy that at least open the possibility that Donald Trump would also not be the president? I'm sure every one of them would have said, hell yes, because they didn't want Donald Trump to be the president. So I think they believed, and I wasn't persuading them to do this. They did this whole action happened independently of me, but they believed they were advancing the interest of the people who had voted for them. And they believe the Constitution entitled them to do that. Now, the court has said 9-0, it doesn't. And I don't question that that's now the law. Although importantly, as our book argues, not all states have binding statutes now. And though I wasn't afraid in 2016 of the consequence of electors voting their conscience, I'm actually quite anxious right now about these electors in the context of an extremely close election. So what our book says is those states that don't have binding statutes need to pass those statutes right now to make sure their electors vote for the candidate who wins the popular vote. And they need to add that little exception that says, unless the candidate dies between election day and electors day, in which case they should vote their conscience or whatever their party says. But I think the question we were just trying to resolve is, what is the law, so that in the middle of a presidential election, you're not having the Supreme Court tell us what the law is and thereby picking the president.
All right, I'm going to give you each a quick final word, but I'm going to frame it in this way, which is that I've come to believe that fear is the register of authoritarianism. And that is why you hear that register spoken from those who are trying to dismantle free, open, and democratic societies. And therefore, when we, as defenders of democracy, speak in the register of fear and anxiety, in some ways, we cede a bit of the playing field to the authoritarians, and that democracy speaks in a register of hope and agency and possibility. So I want to ask you both to offer a final word, but perhaps with that in mind, that we don't want to cede the territory to the register of fear. How would you sum up thoughts at the end of our discussion today, keeping that in mind? And Matt, why don't you go first, and then Larry will end with you.
Well, I think you're exactly right that it's natural, it's understandable to be afraid at the possibilities that are facing America right now, the ones that we write about in this book and so many others. If you believe in liberal democracy, a tradition that's been developing in America for centuries now, it's under threat. And I think it does make sense to be afraid about that, but you can't be paralyzed by that fear. It's so important to recognize that we still do live in a society where people have agency, where you do have the right to vote, where you have the right to speak, where you have the right to petition your government for redress of grievances. And you should use those rights. You should use that power, mobilize the fears that you have in order to make sure that the America that you want to have in 2025 is the America that we do have. And so that's the most important message, that this is not a paralyzing fear, but rather a call to arms, a call to action for all of us to do everything that we can day and night from now until then to make sure that we protect democracy.
Yeah, I don't think we need arms. I agree. We need
let me take that back. Purely metaphorical.
But look, I've been in this democracy reform business now for almost 18 years. There has been enormous progress. People don't recognize this, but enormous progress in those 18 years. I'm not taking credit for it. I'm just reflecting the fact. For example, we came within 2 votes in the Senate of passing what would have been the most ambitious democracy reform package of law, started by John Sarbanes as the For the People Act, but as modified for Joe Manchin in the United States Senate, still quite extraordinary. We came within 2 votes. 10 years ago, that same package would have been inconceivable in the United States Senate. And so therefore, I think we should recognize that this constant drumming that so many activists and so many great groups are pushing, that we need to improve our democracy, is beginning to break through. And as it breaks through, the momentum to get to fundamental changes, I think, will grow. And I think there's a real chance, depending on the election, and we're seeing some optimistic signs in the polling right now, that the next Congress will have a chance to pass that For the People Act bill and begin to think about the other critical problems that leave many people doubting whether we have something like a representative democracy, including fixes for the Electoral College. So though my brand, like yours, Ian, has often been pessimism, I'm finding it hard to sell this book because I'm actually feeling more and more optimistic that America is coming around to recognizing just what's at stake, and that they're coming around to recognizing they're being manipulated by a media that doesn't really want to manipulate them for substantive purposes. It's not like there's editors who are trying to get them to vote one way or the other because of their politics. It's just because it's the best way to sell ads. Like when you begin to see this is what's driving you, it makes it easier to step back and think, what really should I do for the interests of my kids? And that's the final point. The biggest challenge we face on election day is that that people under the age of 40 turn out and vote. The biggest difference in turnout is between people my age and older and people 30 and younger. And what we know by modeling is if people 30 and younger turned out at the same proportion as people 60 and older, it would be a completely different political landscape. So is it feasible, conceivable, realistic to imagine persuading people who are 30 and younger that their future is theirs to save? Because that's literally, in my view, the case. If they turn out, they will produce a democracy that reflects much more what they hope for. And if they don't, the results will produce a democracy which is not what they hope for. And I think that's the challenge, but it's so infinitely possible to make that challenge reality. And so I do think we should be hopeful. And without arms, I think we would take the challenge and try to make that happen.
Well, thank you both so much. I will declare victory on having turned a half-empty glass into a half-full one. I urge everyone to pick up the book, How to Steal a Presidency. It is informative, it is interesting, it is well written, it is frightening, but as you just heard, there is plenty of reason for hope. Thank you to the Ash Center and to all of the promoters of this talk. Matt, Larry, thank you for your incredible work. Hope everyone has a wonderful evening, and I hope we all have a safe, secure, more inclusive, more resilient, more representative democracy in the future. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Ian.